Hi everyone, I'm Jane, and today we're going to talk about something that I get asked more than just about anything else, and that is about paint coverage and paint management. So for those of you who have asked me in the past about why my paint seems to flow so well and cover so much area while you seem to go through so much paint and still have a hard time covering your canvas, this video is for you. I'm going to demonstrate some of the most common issues that I see, and then I'm going to show you how to properly load a brush, the proper brush stroke to use to get the paint to cover the canvas, and more. So I want you to grab a variety of brushes, a paint color, it doesn't matter what color, and a junk canvas. Now let's get started. So as you can see here, I have my canvas sectioned out into some blocks, and in each of these blocks I'm going to demonstrate a specific technique. But before we start doing that, let's go over one of the most important things, and that's choosing the proper brush. Now, the main complaint I hear is that people have a hard time covering the canvas. And I always hear, your paint spreads so smoothly, I can't get my paint to do that, what am I doing wrong? And I would say that at least 50% of the time, it's due to the brush that was chosen. So let's go over how to choose the proper brush. So when you're trying to cover a canvas, for a background, remember that you're contending with texture. Your canvas probably has a little bit of tooth to it, some texture. It's a little bit rough. You need to choose a brush that has the strength to not only move the paint, but also to dig it down into the texture. So let's look at two brushes that look pretty similar. They're the same shape, the same length, but one is soft and one is firm. So we'll start with this one. This is my soft brush, and you can tell because when you flick it backwards, it's quiet. It feels very soft on your skin. And when you push onto the top, see how it deforms quite a bit? That's very soft. If you're still not sure, take the brush onto your forearm where it's very soft here and push just enough so that it bends. And notice how much it deforms your skin. So it's not pressing into my skin too much at all, but the brush is bending almost completely. This brush, on the other hand, is much firmer. So when I flip it back, see it's much louder. It flicks back much faster. When I press onto the top, it doesn't deform a whole lot. It bends a bit, but it doesn't deform a lot. When I put it onto my forearm, just enough to get it to bend about halfway, it presses into my skin quite a bit. So now we know which one of these is a firm brush and which one is a soft brush. And remember I said you want to use a firm brush to cover a background. So that means we're going to use this one. I'm at least going to use this one for the smaller squares. When we get to the larger square here, I will go up to my larger brush. So you do want to kind of choose your brush based on the size of your canvas as well. So if you're using a very small canvas like this, it's easier to use a brush this size. If you're covering a larger canvas, you want to go up a size. And a little bit later, I will demonstrate what this brush does when you try to use it to cover a canvas. So let's start out. I'm going to show you some things that I see quite often, and we're going to start with how not to load a brush. To start off, I have this brush and it's dry, and that's the first no-no. But I see a lot of people load their brush like this, just kind of dunking right into the paint, and they get this tiny amount of paint. That is not enough paint to cover a background. It's great for spot work or detail work, but not for covering. And that leads to the first thing that I see called the scrub. So we take that little amount of paint and we really try and make that go as far as it's gonna go, and we scrub it because it's covering more. But look at how thin that paint is, and we keep scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing, trying to get that paint to cover. And maybe we'll go back and get a little bit more, and we'll start again. And we have to scrub. And it's going to be a very long time before that canvas is covered, but also, like I said, it's very, very thin. Another thing I see when people load a brush improperly is what I call the dunk and scoop. So we kind of come in and scoop up a blob. Just kind of dunk into it and scoop it up. Now we have a bunch of paint all right on the end, and we're gonna throw it down, and all of the paint there that we picked up, it's now just right there. So we have to keep spreading it. We have to keep spreading it. You know, and then we might start scrubbing because it's thin right there, and we have to push really hard to spread it some more. And we get this really inconsistent spread of paint. And like I said, we might start scrubbing because we're like, look at all the paint on my brush. Look at all the paint on this canvas. I have to move that paint around at whatever cost. So remember, this is what happens when we just lightly dip into the paint and try and force it to cover. This is what happens when we scoop our paint and then we have to work to move it from that spot where we plopped it on the canvas. This is too little paint. This is too much paint. Now I'm going to show you the difference between too little and too much water. So I still have some paint on here. I'm going to pick up a little bit more, and I don't have any water on here. Now let's assume that I'm using the proper brush stroke, which I will demonstrate for you later. I'm using the proper brush stroke. I have a decent amount of paint on here, but my brush is dry. So I'm going to start here. It might cover pretty good at first, and then it starts to really fuzz out. And again, I might feel like I have to start scrubbing it so I can come back and get some more paint. See that? Even the first brush stroke with the fresh load of paint, and I'm getting the breaks in the canvas, the white showing through, and I have a hard time. See that? I have a really hard time getting that covered. I'll zoom you in there a little bit more. I'm going to get a bit more paint. Here's my first brush stroke. Remember, this is a dry brush. Look at that. See all of the white spots in there? And then I have to work, and I go over it and over it and over it and over it and over it. And those white spots are still not getting covered, and my paint is starting to get thinner again. Now I'm going to show you too much water. So I'm just going to dip my brush right in and just take it straight out. Maybe I'll shake off a drip. And I'm going to come over to my plate and get some paint. And look at that immediately. You can see how much water is in there. It almost is flowing. If I put a little more pressure, it will start flowing. See that? That's the first sign there's too much water. So I'm going to come into here. I'm getting much better coverage. However, see how streaky that paint is? And it changes as it sits, much like watercolor. And it's transparent in some places. You can see that texture really well. It's covering a lot better than it did over here though. Let's even get just a little more water because I see that often. See how pooled that paint is? And we're gonna put it on there, and you might even see the paint start to run, but see how thin and transparent that is. The next one we're going to do here, I call the scatter. And this is what I see, I would say 90% of the time when people tell me they are having a hard time getting their paint to cover their canvas. So pay close attention to this one if you have that problem, because this might be you. Okay, I've loaded my brush properly. And again, I will show you exactly how to load a brush properly in a minute. So I should be able to cover this background, no problem. Except if you do the scatter brush stroke. So a lot of people will come in here and they start doing this. They just go at it chaotically, just everywhere, you know, not trying to focus on coverage in an area. They're focusing on getting that paint spread across the entire canvas as quick as possible. After that first batch of color didn't cover, we might go back for some more paint and do the same thing. And eventually it will probably cover. But again, look at how inconsistent it is. Very, very thin in places, very heavy in others, lots of crazy chaotic brush strokes. And now I have to come back and try to, get rid of all of those white areas. For this section here, I'm going to show you how just using the wrong part of the brush can make it really hard to cover. So I have a properly loaded brush here. And I'm gonna come in and I'm just gonna kind of scribble with the very tiptoe of the brush. I see this a lot. People come in and it's like they're afraid to put pressure on the brush. And they just kind of do this. See again how thin and streaky, and it doesn't last very long. Then some people will come in and they just kind of use the brush flat like that, which, you know, gives you more paint for sure. But when we're going over it and over it and over it like that, it's really hard to control. It's hard to get an even coverage. You run out of paint really fast. It's super streaky. And then we have, you know, the bend, which is fine. That's actually the part of the brush that you should be using, but not in this way. See, it's just brush stroke after brush stroke on the same part of the brush, and that's not going to cover it. Okay, in these two squares, I'm going to show you the difference between trying to cover a background with a soft brush that has been properly loaded and a firm brush that has also been properly loaded. We'll start with the soft brush. So remember, I said the stiffness of the bristles is what helps dig the paint into the canvas. So here's my soft brush. I'm going to use the proper brush stroke as well, which I haven't shown you yet. And see, immediately, it's not covering the background. I run out of paint. I have to get more. So all of you who say, I go through so much paint, check your brush, because I'm willing to bet that it's very soft. This brush does not have the strength to push it down into the texture. I'm getting a nice thick coverage. See that? That paint's nice and thick, but it's just not strong enough to move the paint around. No matter how much I pick up, I'm really gonna load this brush up. I'm gonna put tons of paint in it. There's a lot of paint in there. But look, immediately, it's not covering. And I'm using a lot of paint, a very lot of paint. And I could probably get it to cover, but man, I'm gonna have to work at that so much, and I'm gonna use a ton of paint. Now I'm gonna use my firm brush. And again, I've loaded it properly, and I'm gonna start trying to cover this little bit of canvas. Look at that. That is covering very nicely. See that? I'm not having a hard time covering that canvas at all. Look at that, that's one load of paint. How many times did I load here? 2 or 3 times? And the color is a little transparent. This color is kind of transparent. I think it's ultramarine from the basics line, so it's a little on the transparent side anyway. But do you see how I covered that? About 3/4 of that square on a single load of paint. I used probably half the amount of paint that I used over here. Okay, so now we know what it looks like when you use too little paint, too much paint, when your brush is too dry, when your brush is too wet, when you try and scattershot and cover the entire canvas on one load of paint, when you stick to a single spot on the brush, when your brush is too soft, and when your brush is just right for your canvas. So now let's go over how to properly load a brush. And I'm gonna go to my 1 inch just because I'm gonna be painting in a larger area. So to properly load a brush, we're gonna take our water, we're gonna put the brush in it, and kind of mush it on the bottom. See that? Let the bristles bend so that it wets the whole brush on the inside and the outside. Now, starting at the ferrule, not just on the bristles, but water collects on the ferrule too. So starting at the ferrule, up, and give that a good scrape on the edge. You should have a good bend going in your brush and water dripping out or flicking all over the place like I just did. Flip your brush over and do the same thing on the other side. If you think you have too much water still in your brush, take a paper towel and touch it right at the base of the bristles, just above the ferrule. I'm not pressing or squeezing, I'm just kind of touching the bristles there. That will suck out any extra water that's kind of living in this fatter part of the brush. Now I'm going to come to my paint and I'm going to show you how to load it properly. Now, a properly loaded brush has paint all throughout the inside of the bristles, not just on the outside. So what we want to do is come into the paint. See that blob there where the blob is? I'm not going to dunk into it. I'm going to grab the edge of that blob, press my brush flat, and kind of pull it back. I'm going to flip my brush over, go into that blob again, just barely. I'm only going into it about 1/8 of an inch. Press my brush flat and bring it back. And I'm going to do that a couple of times. I can do it pretty quick because I'm practiced at it. See how the bristles flare out? That's sucking the paint up like a sponge. And you can go in there and you can load up a ton of paint. See that? And it's not getting up to the ferrule because I'm not going in and doing one of these stir things, which I also see a lot. Don't go into it and stir. That's how you can get paint up into the ferrule here. So again, we're just grabbing the edge of that blob, pull it backwards, squish it flat. I have so much paint loaded up in this brush right now. See that? Tons and tons of paint inside of the brush, not just on the outside. I'm going to demonstrate the brush stroke with this one so that I don't plop all of this paint down in one spot. So what we want to do is remember the different positions of the brush. The tip of the brush is kind of used for blending. See that I'm really just using the tip. That's going to help you blend color. Pressing it completely flat is going to almost wring it out. So like a sponge, if you squeeze it really hard, everything comes out of it. Well, if you push your brush really flat, everything is going to come out of it. It's not going to blend. It's not going to spread. It's just going to squeeze everything out. The one that's going to spread paint is going to be 1/2 foot pressure. So picture your foot, you're standing on the ground like this. If you kind of rock your weight up to the front half of your foot so your heel is off of the ground, that's 1/2 foot pressure. So it's not that, it's not that, it's that. See how it's just bent in half? And we're going to control it by doing small brush strokes, about 1 inch that way. Flip it over to the other side, about 1 inch that way. And every brush stroke overlaps the previous one. We don't move on from that spot until all of the canvas is covered. So, to our brush that's loaded with paint, let me show you. I'm going to come in here and go flat, 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 flat. See that? Small controlled brush strokes. I can do it quick because I'm very practiced at it. I don't want you to try and do it quick until you're practiced at it. But see? Let's see how much of this square I can cover on this one load of paint. I'm still doing that 1/2 foot pressure. And see how I'm not moving on from any spot until everything is covered. I probably should have picked a color not so transparent because it makes my brush strokes look really uneven. Just getting an edge there, still going. And when I need a little extra paint, because see it's starting to wear off, I can push a little harder. See that deposit? Do that again there. Again there. So I'm really just using that 1/2 foot pressure, like I said, until my paint is getting thin. Then I push really hard, get some more of that paint out, and then I can continue. Oh, I almost did it. I was hoping I could cover the whole thing in one brush load. So again, I'm doing that squish that sucks all the paint up into there. If you're starting to get this look, then just lightly dunk the very, very tip of your brush into the water and shake it off. Don't dunk the whole thing into the water, that's too much. And then get paint after you dunk it into the water. And let's see if we can finish this section here on this last load of paint. If I want to get rid of those brush strokes, I will show you how. A little heavier pressure to get some of that paint out. And there we go. And I've got some paint to spare. So to get rid of brush strokes, or at least soften them, remember I said the tip of the brush to blend, so very light pressure. See that? Very light pressure just with the tip of the brush. and it helps soften those brush strokes. With a transparent color like this, you would want to let it dry completely and then go back over it with another coat if you want to, make it a little bit more opaque. Don't resort to scrubbing if you feel like it's not covering properly. Okay, so there I've smoothed out quite a few of the brush stroke marks, which, like I said, on a transparent color is a little more difficult, but there we go. All right, we're going to talk about one last thing that is so incredibly important. It doesn't really have anything to do with covering a background, but it bears reminding because this is incredibly important. And that is how to properly clean and care for a brush. So I have my brush here. It still has my paint on it from when I covered this section. Let's go over how to clean it. First of all, I always have 2 jars of water, and they're both clean, clear water. We're going to put the brush in the water, see how it's resting against the bottom, and I'm going to push it so it bends a little, just like when we were loading it. I'm just going to swipe it back and forth across the bottom. I'm not stabbing it. Do not stab your brush. It will flare the bristles out. You will destroy the brush very quickly. In fact, back when I used to do paint parties at my gallery, I had a brand new brush one time that was being stabbed a lot, and it was destroyed after the first use. So do not stab it. Just swipe it back and forth across the bottom. You can make sure it's bending. My brush is bending. I'm getting that 1/2 foot pressure. Back and forth. Pretty aggressively. When you're done, bring it out and press it on the edge. And if there's still paint in it, you should see paint kind of squeeze out from between the bristles. Of course, blue water's coming out because the water's blue. Now I'm going to take my other jar of clean water and I'm going to do the same thing. See how it's bent on the bottom? Back and forth like that. And I should not see this water starting to turn blue. If I do, then I need to go back into the other jar and clean it again. Wipe it on the edge. Again, checking for paint. I don't see any paint coming out. My water is still pretty clear, you can't really tell. I'm going to do one more check to see if I got all the paint out. I'm going to take a clean paper towel. I'm going to press it to the bottom here, right where the bristles meet the ferrule. Just press the paper towel there, and I'm going to kind of bend it up. And look, even though my brush looked clean, look at the blue paint that came out. That's not the water. The water isn't blue enough to stain it like that. Check the other side. There's still paint in here. So I'm going to do it one more time. Flinging paint water everywhere, of course. And rinse. And we're going to check it again. And look at that. No blue paint on my paper towel, so my brush is now clean. Next, we want to reshape the brush. I don't want it to dry all flared out like that. So I'm going to wipe it smooth on one side, wipe it smooth on the other, which also is removing a little extra water. I'm going to put it on the edge, push that edge back in. I'm just really trying to regain the nice shape. Now, I, and you may as well, like to store my brushes standing up in a jar. However, never stick a wet brush in a jar upright or down. Either way, you can either hang it upside down. Some people have made little contraptions with, clothespins that kind of hold it. That's perfectly fine. What I tend to do is take a dry paper towel, not this wet one. You wouldn't want to use a wet one. I take a dry paper towel after I've reshaped it. I make sure that the bristles are on the paper towel, and I make sure that it's laying flat on a tabletop, just laying perfectly flat. And I don't move it or put it in my stand-up jar until it's completely dry. The reason for that, if I stand it up in a jar like this while there's still water in the bristles, the water can soak down into the ferrule, which loosens the glue, and that glue is what holds the bristles in, but it also holds the ferrule onto the handle. Here is a sample handle that I got from my manufacturer while I was making my brushes. And as you notice, it's covered in this lacquer. The lacquer is what protects the brush from water. That's why you can get the handle wet, and it's okay, it doesn't destroy the wood. However, underneath the ferrule, the wood is exposed. Now the reason for that is because it's part of the manufacturing process. When the lacquer is being put on, it's held up here at the top, either by something going down into the wood, or maybe there's a dowel bit that's cut off afterwards. But anyway, it's held up at the top somehow and then dipped into the lacquer. And that leaves some exposed wood on the top, which isn't an issue because then there's glue in here and those are pressed down and they seal the wood. Okay, so it's not an issue. It's not bad that this wood is exposed. It really, if the brush is cared for properly, that doesn't matter. So the glue is put in, the ferrule's pushed down, and then it's crimped at the bottom. See those bands right there? That's crimped to really pinch it onto the wood. Now, if the water soaks down into here, it can loosen the glue. It can also penetrate this wood. And what happens when the wood gets wet in here, it swells up. And when it swells up, it can crack the varnish and it can stretch out the crimps in the ferrule. Once it dries, the wood shrinks, and it actually will shrink probably a little bit smaller than it was originally. Now there's a big gap between the ferrule and the handle, which lets more water in next time. And it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. This is also the reason I tell you to never, ever, ever leave your brushes sitting in your water. My rule of thumb is the longest a brush should ever sit in the water is just long enough to clean it. That's it. I never ever drop my brush in my water and leave it, not even for 30 seconds, never. Now I know that a lot of people will do that. They insist that it's okay, they've done it before, and their brushes have never been ruined. And that's possible, for sure. The thing is that a quality brush that you might spend a little bit more money on, it may sound strange, those brushes are more likely to be damaged if you let them sit in water than, say, a value pack brush, a more inexpensive brush. And I will tell you why. So here's this brush that I have. It came out of a value pack of, I think, something crazy like 25 brushes for $9. I've had this brush for years and years, and it still looks pretty decent. It doesn't work great, which is why I don't ever use it, but it looks okay. Part of that is because the handle is plastic. So the plastic doesn't absorb water, it doesn't swell. It's also more likely to break. Ask me how I know that. I've broken many plastic handle brushes. The ferrule is also attached probably with heat because you can kind of feel where the plastic, it almost feels a little melted right under there. So it's pretty permanently attached. Even if you leave it soaking, that glue is probably not going to come undone. And the ferrule's probably not going to come off. You may still lose the bristles. The glue may come loose here and the bristles may fall out. Where my nice brush, the higher quality materials, they do tend to be a little bit more delicate. Wood is susceptible to damage in water. It's also, if properly cared for, much more long lasting. Plastic brushes, I've had them snap right off in my hand before, Look, if I just put a little pressure on it, it bends. It's pretty fragile. Where a wood handle brush is going to be a little bit more resilient to accidental breakage. Another thing that happens if you leave brushes sitting in water is that they bend. So I don't know if you can see that. Probably not because it's kind of deformed. So the brush will kind of, the weight of it will push it down. If you've ever seen a brush that, looks like it's kind of dried like that with a bend, it's probably been left in water. So here in my water is one of my brushes and the cheaper plastic brush I showed you. And you can't really tell, but I encourage you to experiment with your own brushes and see if you can tell. Yeah, there, hopefully you can tell. My brush with the more quality bristles is bending quite a bit more in the water. Because it's a softer brush, it's more responsive when you use it. The cheaper brush, the bristles are a little more plasticky, and when they sit in the water, they don't bend as much. So, being left to sitting in the water for the same amount of time, my brush is going to be damaged in one way or the other long before the cheaper brush will. But you know, the difference comes into play when you're actually using it. So while this one might be more resilient to being abused, this one's going to do a better job of actually applying the paint to the canvas. So the moral of that rant, please don't abuse your brushes. Wash them properly. Never ever let them sit in water for any longer than it takes to just wash the brush. So I hope that today I was able to address the specific issue that you may be facing. And I hope that you see now how to work around that so that you don't have that issue anymore and you can get a fairly even coverage even with a transparent color like ultramarine blue. Remember, as with any other aspect of painting, everything comes with practice. This will come with practice. Just because I've shown you how to do it properly doesn't mean that you're immediately going to get it. You very well may, but you may still struggle just a little bit. And it's because your brain, your hand, your eye, everything is learning. And every time you pick up a brush and practice it, you learn a little bit more that you can take on to the next time you pick up a brush. So please don't be frustrated if you watch this and you still feel like you're struggling. For example, if you feel like you use too much water, just be conscious of that. And each time you pick up the brush, try to use a little bit less water. And then you may swing the other way and end up using not enough water. And that's fine. Now consciously work on adding just a little bit more water and eventually you'll kind of work it into the middle, right? So don't be frustrated if you bounce back and forth between these two. Just keep working on that. For the specific brush that you're using, for the specific paint brand that you're using, your paint to water ratio may vary from what I've used, and you have to find that for yourself. If you keep at it and you're gentle with yourself, you don't allow yourself to get frustrated and angry, you just keep working at it, you will eventually get it. I give you the tips just to kind of get you on the right path, but ultimately practice is what's going to help you overcome any of these issues that you're having. And finally, remember that just because I pointed out each of these techniques as being wrong, it doesn't mean they're useless techniques. What it means is none of these techniques are right for this, to cover a background in a solid color. None of these are going to do that. So even though these are the wrong techniques for this, they're important techniques to learn. So I encourage you to actually learn these if you don't already use them, because they may come in handy in some other painting that you're doing. Also, I do have a video on detail brush use, and we cover a lot of these same topics in that video. So you can click the information iCard somewhere up here, or at the end of the video, I will link it as well. And that will show you how most of these techniques and a few others apply to detail brush work. If there's a specific issue along these lines that I haven't addressed but that you're experiencing, feel free to leave me a comment below and I'll see if I can either answer that for you right there or maybe I can include it in a future video. Thank you as all for watching, everyone. I hope that I helped you learn something new today, and I'll see you next time.